We should move on. We are going to move on to something that is related to this situation, of course, and continuing what is a rather serious conversation we're having today, and that is Syria and Australia in particular. I mean, the indications are strong that the Turnbull government is moving away from the Abbott government's position that Bashar al-Assad needs to be removed in order to have some type of political stability in Syria.
Is that wise?
Well, that's the question, really. Is that wise, and what are the ramifications of that? I mean, you know, both Julie Bishop and Malcolm Turnbull arguing there needs to be a political solution, not a military solution, and that they're saying the Assad regime would be pivotal in having some type of solidifying force in Syria. So we wanted to talk about this. This shift has been noted by many people, particularly given what Obama and Cameron are saying, you know, that Assad must go. So joining us today to help us unpack a bit of this shift in Australian policy and its implications is a former National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, also from the Brookings Institute and the Centre for International Security Studies at University of Sydney, Peter Khalil. Thank you for joining us on To The Point.
Thanks for having me on, Christina and Peter.
Well, recent statements by the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister do suggest that there is some shift. As you know, in diplomacy circles, subtle differences are important. Describe briefly where you see Australia diverging from the US and the UK on the question of Bashar al-Assad.
Well, I think there is a remarkable shift by the Foreign Minister in her statements, particularly in New York last week. And what's remarkable about it is that Julie Bishop has been a steady hand as Foreign Minister. She's done a terrific job on the Peter Gress case. She's done a great job at the UN representing Australia and galvanising international response to the MH17 crisis. So what's so remarkable about this shift is that she's putting Australia at odds with our key Western allies, the US and the UK, as well as our Arab allies in the Gulf. And fundamentally, in a sense, she is articulating what is the Iranian, Russian and Hezbollah position, that there is no viable alternative to Bashar al-Assad. When you have Secretary of State John Kerry, Philip Hammond, the UK Foreign Secretary, running around New York in the past week and a half, emphasising to everyone that would listen that any political transition, any successful political transition requires the removal of Assad. And I would add that where I think that's fundamentally wrong, the position is that every opposition group, whether it's Islamist or secular, and there are a lot of opposition groups in Syria, have all agreed that they will not engage with the Syrian government until Assad is removed.
But Peter, some people might argue that Australia's position can be described as noble realism, given that there appears to be no realistic alternative leader in Syria.
Yes, I've heard that phrase, noble realism. I think it's really the realism of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah and what their strategic objectives are in Syria. Russia and Putin wants to prop up Assad to ensure and consolidate Russia's military and economic interests in the country, to rub the nose of the US in the relative failure that the West and the US has had in Syria over the last 4 years in ending this conflict. And of course Iran and Hezbollah would like to see Assad remain in power indefinitely, and they really showed their hand, what their version of realism was in the first Russian airstrikes, where they actually hit the opposition groups that were the secular or the Western-backed moderate Islamist opposition groups that may have or should form part of the opposition in a transitional government. So they've really demonstrated what their realism is all about.
What do you think about the focus on ISIS when al-Nusra are pretty much every bit as brutal in many ways?
Yeah, look, that's a good question, Peter. The two, there's a spectrum of Islamist groups, and obviously right at the end, in the most brutal end of the spectrum, the most vicious end of the spectrum, are Daesh or ISIS and al-Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda-backed organisation or affiliated organisation. Then it's kind of like the life of Brian. You have, the Judean People's Front, the People's Front of Judea. You have the Syrian National Council, the coalition of Syrian opposition groups, political umbrellas, and 11 or 12 sub-factions under the Free Syrian Army that are more relatively more moderate or secular. And I think the real answer here is, and what the West has been trying to do, and has not been very successful in doing, is isolating the opposition groups, the secular and the more moderate Islamist opposition groups, away from ISIS and al-Nusra, bring them into a transitional government, but they'll only do that if Assad is gone. And here's the problem with some of the statements made by our Foreign Minister in that articulating a position which concludes that there is no viable alternative, we have to do business with Assad, makes it all the more harder for President Obama and Secretary Kerry and Prime Minister Cameron to try and drive forward a political transition that would work.
Now, President Obama said this week that Iran and Syria make up the entirety of Russia's coalition in Syria. Would you go as far as to say that Australia's shift is actually giving aid and comfort, diplomatic aid and comfort to Russia's position?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I would say, though, that by making those statements, and as you pointed out in the beginning, Christina, diplomacy is very subtle and there are subtexts, but by making that slight shift that our Foreign Minister has, and by the way, she's also saying quite clearly that in the longer term Assad has to go, which is similar and the same, I should say, as the Western position generally. The West has conceded on the timing of his removal, but they still maintain that he must go as soon as possible for there to be a political transition. But what happens there is that whether it's President Putin or indeed Foreign Minister Zarif, who I think made comments in the Weekend Australian, they can point to a key Western ally in Australia and say that they agree with us. They agree with our position
Peter,
and the fact that Assad has to stay.
Isn't the biggest problem here, though, just thinking about this in terms of, I guess, tactically how they deal with this, as well as strategically, that if you turn your guns on Assad as well as ISIS, you find yourself in a position where ISIS, perhaps from their position of considerable strength, as well as with that porous border with Iraq, they would be able to run over the top of Assad, and then the opposition forces wouldn't be strong enough to be able to resist. Whereas if you prop Assad up for a while, then there's the potential there for the opposition forces to have a better hand in taking on Assad once Islamic State has been degraded sufficiently.
Yeah, I've heard that argument, and that is effectively part of the Russian argument that we need to prop up Assad first, and then deal with ISIS, and then we can deal and bring the opposition in. Unfortunately, with the first Russian airstrikes and the ongoing manoeuvres of Iranian ground troops and Hezbollah fighters, they are taking out the opposition groups, the secular opposition groups that are backed by the West, and the more moderate Islamist groups backed by the Gulf states. So, and I think there's a fundamental error in that assumption, because in fact over the last couple of years, and you know that Syria is like a leopard skin now. There's blocks of different groups that control territory. The Free Syrian Army, some of the moderate groups control territory, and they have been fighting both Assad and Daesh at the same time, with support from the West and the Gulf states. And in fact, they've made significant inroads into Assad's territory, and this is the secular opposition groups near the Latakia airbase. And so it's no coincidence that Russia and Putin made his move to prop up Assad, because he's really been losing ground in the last couple of months to that Free Syrian Army or those collection of more secular opposition groups. So I don't think it's impossible for those opposition groups to fight both Assad and Daesh at the same time. They've been doing it for the last couple of years.
Peter, just quickly in the time we've got left, it's somewhat unusual for any foreign minister, but particularly Julie Bishop, to freelance or shift away from our allies on such a significant issue. What do you think is driving, what do you suspect is driving her shifting position?
Well, look, there has been clearly a strong effort made by the Foreign Minister to engage with the Iranian regime over the past year, particularly around the attempt to return, I think, around 8,000 Iranian asylum seekers back to Iran. And also, look, let's be honest, there is a significant business push. You know, European businesses, Australian agribusinesses are falling over themselves at the $56 billion of unfrozen Iranian assets as part of the deal that the US did with Iran on the nuclear deal. So, I mean, I think my problem with that is, if that is the driving force behind the subtle shift that our minister has made, our foreign minister has made, then she's putting short-term political gain, tactical gain around that particular asylum seeker deal over a longer-term geostrategic positioning with our allies, and making it more difficult, indeed, for a successful political transition.
Peter, let me ask you this, complete change of topic to some extent. Would you send your kids to the high school where the terror raids happened today?
I thought you might ask me that, Peter. Well, my kids are 3 years old and 4 months old, so they're not old enough. But I'm not going to fudge the question. I'm not fudge the answer. I'm not going to. No, I actually wouldn't. And I say that with a heavy heart because I think communities have to band together to resist the type of radicalisation that's going on, in different parts of Australia. And the more people that are involved in that process, the better with families and communities. But a bit like you, I put my children's safety first.
Peter, Khalil, thank you so much for joining us on To The Point.
Thank you.
Thank you.